Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is David Malone.
And my name's Ian Stroud, and this is Hyperland.
How you doing, Ian?
I'm really good, thank you.
I've been doing a lot more work on bird flu.
Oh, yes,
and,
good.
Some of it has rolled back to COVID as well. And
Is that surprising?
No, I suppose not. Well, it is and it isn't. I mean, when you go to talk to people about one thing, it's kind of interesting when they then say, but wait a minute, let's go back and talk about.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, the people who were involved in COVID are largely the same people who were involved with bird flu.
Yeah,
same people were involved in SARS. Same people were involved with Ebola and all the way back to HIV.
Yeah, no,
it's
but
a very small world.
Yeah, you were sort of saying though that it's the same PR scientists that have been reporting not very well. I'll say that.
Yeah, well, certainly giving a very narrow point of view. Yeah.
Okay, so and where do you want to start? Do you want to go to the COVID or are we mixing all of this up?
Yes, we are. Well, let's start a little bit with bird flu because it's just really the link back to COVID, which is interesting. Okay. I hadn't really realized just what a tiny world it is, that when you go from COVID all the way back to HIV in the 80s, it's the same. I said, think about a dozen people, because Fauci started with HIV.
Yeah.
And not only the scientists, but the same journalists.
Yes.
Like Cohen, who is one of the big cheerleaders he writes in Science, and he's been one of the main cheerleaders for it's a zoonotic origin. Lab leak is just conspiracy theory. And he goes all the way back to HIV as well.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, because one of the things which happened back in end of the last century, beginning of 2000, was the hypothesis that did HIV leak was it the result of a botched vaccination program in Africa?
Yeah, well, there was two, wasn't there? There was one in Africa and there was another one there was a Russian originated.
Yeah,
there was a kind of race to get to the vaccination.
To provide the vaccine, tuberculosis vaccine.
Yeah.
And that hypothesis really, really upset the scientific establishment.
Did they not go? And in London, was there not?
There was a big meeting.
Meeting, and
I talked to Ed Hooper, who was the man who really put forward the hypothesis that it may have come from a botched vaccination program, and I talked to the scientist who really arranged that Royal Society meeting.
Yes, that's all.
I mean, it's a complicated story and a really interesting one. I'd like to come back to it in another podcast. But all I was really going to raise at this point is what's really interesting is it suddenly dawned on me. Let's just suppose that they're right, that it was not the result of a botched vaccination, that it was a natural origin, which obviously is what Fauci and they all insisted upon.
Mm-hmm.
Then let's say they're right. What then would have happened is they would have had this terrible fright in the early 2000s, when suddenly there's this hypothesis that it might have been as the result of scientific, if not outright malfeasance, then making horrible mistakes. Now, from their point of view, if they knew that that wasn't the case, they were faced with this viral spread of something which sounded plausible, but which they knew wasn't true. And so you can imagine how that absolutely impacted on all of their lives, because here they were being accused of, the scientific world was being accused of having done something unwise or possibly even criminally wrong, which has led to the deaths of millions upon millions upon millions of people.
Yeah.
And so you can imagine how, and I think, journalists like Cohen were quick to defend science because they were told by the scientists, no, this is wrong, this is terrible, and this could be a catastrophically damage Western science.
Yeah.
If that's what happened then, and it absolutely scarred these people, you can sort of understand how when it comes 20 years later, there's people saying COVID might have leaked from a lab. It's going to raise all of that history, that thing. And I suddenly thought, okay, I can understand why they rushed immediately to circle the wagons and said right at the start, no, we're absolutely certain this didn't happen.
Yeah.
And of course, if you then imagine it the other way, the much darker interpretation, which was, okay, let's say Ed Hooper was right. And I mean, his book, The River, is huge and not easy to dismiss.
Yeah.
And although in that Royal Society meeting,
he was dismissed,
they knocked it on the head.
Yeah.
If you look at that meeting and look at everything that was done, no. I mean, I'm not saying that Hooper was right.
Yeah.
But it wasn't absolutely knocked on the head at the time, and it still isn't. So if you take the darker interpretation that maybe that's still an open question, you could see that when COVID rolls around, they'd be even more petrified of that narrative getting any traction, the narrative that it
raising its head again,
mistake, because then they'd think, oh my God, if we allow anyone to take this seriously, the next thing you know, they're going to be saying, well, wait a minute, oh yeah, SARS, that was botched by the Chinese Communist Party, and then maybe we should go back and look at AIDS. For me, you suddenly think, okay, this is beginning to make sense. Why were those Western scientists so absolutely determined,
adamant, and quick to
knock? Exactly, because even whether the HIV hypothesis was true or not, you can understand either way. I begin to think, okay, I understand the alarm with which they reacted to the COVID story.
The weird thing that I was thinking about when we were talking about the COVID origin, and this is probably really my usual very unhelpful self, is actually the man-made, it came out of a lab, is the safer of the two options. And it sounds mad, but if it came from natural origins, we've got no control of that. If it's been somebody's mistake, then that's... do you see what I'm getting at? I
do, yeah.
Like, you stop doing that and you stop making mistakes.
Yeah, but absolutely true. But there's another way of looking at that same situation. If it's a natural origin, it says open the taps of funding for the heroic scientists who are going to protect us. So A, they're cast as heroes, and B, they get a lot of money.
I'm so naive.
If it's the other way around, A, they're the villains, and B,
the money gets cut.
You have to stop doing the dangerous science.
Yeah.
So that, for me, explains a lot. The stuff I was looking at just recently, which was the stuff coming out of what the bird flu research has begun to show me, is that there's another pattern of people being unwilling to entertain certain hypotheses because it harms them. I've now talked to most of the major players who were there in the key labs, doing the key work in the hospitals, at the CDC, in the Pentagon. I've talked now to most of the top players. I've definitely talked to the top 3 virologists concerned with bird flu in the world now. And it's interesting, they all agree with the point that part of the problem is that the global intensive farming industry, so intensive poultry farming, intensive pig farming, absolutely won't countenance the idea that it's their farming practices which may be providing the perfect breeding environment for the highly pathogenic versions of bird flu to evolve. And yet when I put it to all of them, they absolutely said, yeah, well, of course it is. Yeah. The notion that it's just that the key breeding ground to evolve the pathogenic is in wild animals doesn't make any sense to them.
Yeah.
And even the person who has the most invested in that hypothesis, who I really thought was going to say, oh no, it's absolutely in the wild, it's the wild birds who are breeding it. Even he was willing to admit and said to me straight out, and he thinks the wild birds are important, but he said, in 40 years of surveying them, we've never found, or hardly ever found, high pathogenic versions of the virus in the wild birds. And I said, well, that's a bit of a problem for your hypothesis. And to his credit, he said, yeah, absolutely.
And going back to that kind of farming, it's all about they're in biosecure, not really factories. They're being fed themselves, and all the routes seem to follow either the sort of trade routes, the food routes.
Well, that bit I don't know. I was asking someone who had been very, very senior in the CDC about that, and
CDC
they agreed
is
that the Centers for Disease Control, basically it's the part of the American government which is charged with monitoring and then dealing with serious outbreaks of disease amongst humans. So bird flu, COVID, Ebola, anything.
Yeah.
And they're probably the number one organization in the world, mainly because they're just so big.
Yeah.
And I've had dealings with the CDC before when I was making the rabies film. And this person was laughing at the idea of biosecure farms.
Well, we did that before. Again, because I'm thinking it's got pupil recognition at the doors and everyone's in suits and no, it's got a handle on the door so the birds can't go out.
Yeah, we were laughing. I said, well, biosecure farm is the same kind of phrase as military intelligence and jumbo shrimp. And she just went, biosecure. She said, I grew up on a farm. Biosecure farm. Yeah, military intelligence. So yeah, it doesn't work. So it's just got me thinking again about the fact that when you get science involved with politics and money, it's ridiculous to think that somehow science and scientists are above the usual
morality of
they are such pure creatures that nothing will induce them to not tell the truth.
I do see them like that though. It's kind of this whole thing of go and ask an expert. I don't want to listen to social media
or politicians or
politicians. I want to go to the experts, and they're the people I will trust.
And that really is the important thing, because for a culture like ours, if that feeling that you have is completely eroded away, I think that's an absolute catastrophe for a culture like ours. And that's the real danger. And I think what happened with COVID has made a lot of people not feel like you do anymore. They're thinking, well, I don't know if I can trust the scientists. And this brings me back to a story I wanted to tell about the COVID research. One of the other things that was left out. It concerns a man called George Gao. George Gao was...
he's the Chinese scientist that came out and said, don't disregard the theory of it's come out of a lab. And that was probably the first time anyone had in China had come out and sort of said that.
Yeah. Well, anyone since Zhao and Zhao were rounded up and silenced anyway.
Of course, with the little map.
Yes, exactly. Now, George Gao was head of the CDC. He's one of sort of like the top 2 or 3 most famous scientists in China.
Yeah.
And I've now talked to 3 people who knew him well and worked with him. Mm-hmm. And they all say the same thing, that he was an excellent scientist. They counted him as a friend, and they thought he was a genuinely good person.
Yeah.
And this, the person I was talking to from CDC was saying really interestingly that she and people like her were really, I can't remember the exact word she used, but they were horrified basically at what had happened, because she said there was a period where they really felt that a cadre, a sort of generation of scientists they'd worked with and younger scientists that they'd helped to train up, that they felt these people were colleagues that they knew and trusted, and many of them were their friends. They were people that they cared about and knew they could trust. And then she said the new leadership in China came in, 2011. By 13, 14, the new leadership had grabbed all the levers of power, and she said that trust had just been completely gone. And we knew we could no longer trust the people we used to implicitly trust, the people we trained and worked with and knew. We could no longer trust them to tell the truth. And she said that as a general point. And she also knew George Gao. And it just took me back to the story that I was told when we were making the film. And the story is that George Gao was head of the CDC. And so the story goes that it was reported in the New Yorker, and two other people have related the same story, one of whom had heard it secondhand, and another one had heard it from Redfield. This is really early on. This is January the 3rd. So really 2020. Really early on. Okay, so Robert Redfield, director of the Centers for Disease Control, CDC, speaks with George Gao. And he was basically saying, we could send a CDC team to Wuhan to help investigate what's going on. And the reason that he'd phoned is he knew, because it'd already been published, that in those first 27 cases, there'd been several family clusters. And we talked about in the thing we did on COVID that right back then, I can't remember, like 6 or 7 of those cases had no contact with the wet market, suggesting rather strongly that this would already be human to human.
Well, the first one, I think, from memory, was November, and one of the family, they weren't even in the area, were they?
No, exactly. But we know that now. But Redfield is reading this in the Western press, and he can see that. So when we said that in the one we did on COVID, it's not just us making this, not just us making this up. This was an inference made by Redfield at the time, head of the CDC. This doesn't look good, and although when we did that first podcast, we were careful to say that's not a slam dunk piece of proof. But when it's a new and potentially very virulent disease, you need to err on the side of caution. Well, here's the proof. There's head of the CDC
phoning
I'm going to call
saying,
George Gao because I'm thinking this.
I'm worried.
So exactly. So he says we'll send a team, and George Gao says he doesn't have the permission to accept that kind of
assistance.
So they stonewall the Americans and say, no, we don't. You can't send people here to help, which doesn't sound good. And Redfield actually made a formal request to the Chinese government, and actually had got about 24 people together ready to go. And the Chinese government didn't send any invitations, so you weren't allowed to go. A few days later, so we're still talking early January, he has another phone call with George Gao. And they're talking again about, could this have been human to human? Now, the way it was told to me by the two people that I interviewed, one of whom knew George Gao and also knew Redfield, that they were talking about the possibility of, could it be human to human transition? Were those early cases indicative that, were they suggesting that must be the truth? And they said to me, the people who told me about the conversation, he wouldn't come out and say, yes, I think it's human to human, but he started to cry. Now, this is a senior Chinese scientist. He starts to cry on the phone and says, I think we're too late. And the other person who I spoke to said, and he also said, this is really, really dangerous.
Wow.
So what does it mean? I think we're too late for what?
Well.
And why is it really, really dangerous? The point is, George Gao was, you couldn't be more powerful as a scientist in China than George Gao.
Yeah.
But he wasn't able to just simply come out and say, no, it's not human to human, or, yeah, I think it is. He's not able to.
No.
And when I heard that story, I then thought to myself, well, how do I back that up? Because obviously I can't call up George Gao because
were you gagged?
Yeah, exactly. Like Xi Zhengli, the Batwoman.
Yeah.
If there's anyone I feel slightly sorry for, it's her, because her life is over. She's never going to be allowed to speak to anyone ever without a dozen minders.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, who can I talk to? So I managed to contact Ai Weiwei, the artist.
Oh, architect, artist.
Yes. Yeah. He did the Bird's Nest.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Ai Weiwei is, to become the architect for the Bird's Nest, you have to be a celebrity in your own country and politically well connected.
Yeah.
Now, the thing about Ai Weiwei is his dad had been a dissident. His dad had been arrested for saying the wrong thing. So this was a part of his childhood. And he has been critical of the Chinese Communist Party and was, they felt his collar, and he's now in exile.
Yeah.
And I was able to interview him. Now, this didn't go into the film for complicated reasons, which I can't really go into. Okay. Otherwise, I'll get in trouble with someone. But Ai Weiwei was really interesting. And what he said to me, and I'm paraphrasing this so that I'm not infringing anyone's copyright.
Yeah.
He very clearly said, you're being naive, and Western scientists are being naive if they think that a top scientist in a very politicized piece of science is able to just say, yeah, well, I know my government wouldn't like this, but here's the truth.
Yeah.
He said that's utterly naive. He said, one, to become a senior scientist, you have to pretty much become a member of the party.
Yeah.
And basically take the oath saying, my number one allegiance is to the party.
Yeah.
Two, the heads of most important labs are in the PLA, the People's Liberation Army.
Yeah.
And certainly I think the head of the Wuhan Institute was PLA. And so I felt really strong then and do now that Western scientists, people like Farah and Horton and all of the various embedded lackeys in the press, have been catastrophically naive. Because when we talk to them, and those who would agree to talk to us and those who wouldn't, just in all the things they've written, they all say, we trust our Chinese colleagues. They're wonderful people. Of course, they're telling us the truth.
Yeah. Well, they're telling you the truth as much as possible. I mean, the big question is, who is deciding what is best for the party?
Exactly.
This
and
not
look,
getting out.
We know, we know, you and I know, the public knows, Jeremy Farrar knows, Fauci knows that people, for instance, Xi Zhengli said in public that no work had been done at the WIV by the Chinese military. And we now know that is absolutely false.
Yeah. So
there's an example where she did lie. And as the person I spoke to today said, echoing what Ai Weiwei had said, which is, it's not surprising they lied because their families would be threatened.
Yeah, yeah.
It's all right for you and me to be brave sitting here where we live.
Well,
it's going to tell the truth.
Yeah.
I mean, no one's going to come and cart us away or arrest our family.
Yeah, we're seeing it all over the world at the moment, and particularly this week.
And the political entity which controls the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which controls the lives and well-being of George Gao and Xi Zhengli and every other scientist in China, is the same government that says, we're not doing anything to the Uyghurs. No, it's nothing at all. They said, no, we never invaded Tibet. Tibet's part of China, always has been. I've been to Tibet. It's not Chinese. It's a completely separate culture. And say to you, oh, Tiananmen Square, nothing happened there.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel something has gone really wrong. You have to look at people like Farrer and Horton and, Fauci and say, are they just simpletons that they go, oh, well, no, I mean, I know George Gow, he's a nice bloke. He'd never tell me a lie. If I ask him to tell me the truth about something which would vastly embarrass his, the government of his country, of course, George is just going to stand up and tell me the truth.
Yeah.
What kind of a simpleton do you have to be?
Yeah.
Now, I don't think Jeremy Farrer or Fauci are simpletons. And if they're not simpletons,
what's their motive?
Then what are they?
Yeah.
And I can't at this point help but feel that science isn't any longer in key areas speaking truth to power, that it has been corrupted by power.
Yeah.
That they are like the Catholic Church was before the Reformation. They're there for their own reasons, handing out indulgences. Pay me this money and I'll my God will let you off the hook and forgive you your sins. And I really think that Western science desperately it is time for a scientific reformation, just like the Catholic Church need a reformation. And, I'm not saying that all scientists are bad any more than all priests were bad. I can understand George Gow not being able to tell the truth and crying on the phone.
But you can't understand
his family could have been rounded up, but
you can't understand the others just going along with it.
Yeah, do they really think that Xi Zhengli and George Gow were telling them the truth? Do they really think that? Mm-hmm. I find that difficult to believe. And if they didn't believe that, then they're party to a lie for their own reasons.
Yeah.
And I think science needs a reformation. Where science has gotten involved with big money and big power, it has become corrupt.
Yeah.
And things like the WHO, while there are good people who, I know some of them on the ground, they're good people doing good things for good reasons. The hierarchy,
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed it, please leave a review.
And if you'd like to leave a comment, which would be great, we've set up a Hyperland Substack. So go to Substack, look up Hyperland, leave us a comment. We'd love to know what you think. And if you've got ideas that we should cover, that would be great too. Thanks a lot.
Brilliant. Thank you.